Hi, welcome everyone to the IWFM webinar series, episode 18, Brexit, where are we and what awaits? Next slide. I'm Philip Kennedy, the Head of Facilities at Kennedy's Law and a committee member of IWFM's International SIG. Welcome to the 18th episode in IWFM's Navigating Turbulent Times webinar series. We're exploring the implications and the future relationship between the UK and the EU. We originally called this episode Have You Forgotten About Brexit? Because it seems like a subject starting once again to emerge from the shadows as the countdown to the future relationship has continued unabated despite the global COVID-19 crisis. Today we're joined by David Massingham, a familiar face to many of you who have attended our ISIG events over the years. We're delighted that he's agreed to set out his thoughts and insights for us in into what the next few months and of course 1st of January 2021 holds for us all. For those who have not attended before one of David's sessions and aren't familiar with him, here's a quick introduction. David is a highly respected political analyst whose talks to our group have been highlights in our annual events calendar. He's spoken on many subjects that influence both our professional and personal lives. By not being an expert in our industry, David's talks provide a refreshing insight about society, both business and economic, and the context on the world stage. I'll hand you over to David now for a 30-minute presentation. Please do ask questions via the chat function, and these will be put to David to respond after the formal overview. Thanks. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Philip, and hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be back. It feels like if I was writing a TV series, it would be kind of series 7, episode 12, and I'd be struggling to think, what are we going to put into the plot line to refresh this? And in fact, I was thinking that up until just a couple of days ago, but things have turned out in such a way that the plot is perhaps thicker than I could ever have imagined. So let's make a start. So first slide, please. It's worth going back, I think, to where we were a little over 4 years ago, the referendum at the end of June 2016, and the key proponents of Brexit, a lot of the key players in that campaign, David Davis, Liam Fox, Michael Gove, Redwood, and so on, telling us how easy and how straightforward the next phases would be. 4 years on, those promises seem like a very, very long time ago. Next slide, please. What happened, of course, was the prolonged agony of Theresa May, who found herself completely isolated in her negotiations with the EU 27 over the withdrawal agreement, badgered and harried at every turn by the hardliners of the Conservative Party's European research group that led really to successive defeats in Parliament for her proposed approach and for the proposed agreement that she was reaching. The 2017 electoral disaster, when at a time riding high in the polls, and I remember doing one of these sessions with you just before that election and saying that I thought she would win with a majority of around 70. So you probably want to take everything else that I say with a pinch of salt. But she lost the slender majority that she had, put herself into an even more difficult negotiating position because she became dependent on the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, and of course their hard line on the future border between the UK and the EU. That led, of course, to a series of more parliamentary defeats as she twisted and turned to try and get an agreement through, and eventually she was outed, or ousted, should I say. So the next slide brings us to the triumph of Boris Johnson, who kind of was pretty much acclaimed as leader by the Conservative Party. And I think it's important to remember that initially Boris Johnson's mandate came not from the country at large, but from the very small number of people who are members of the Conservative Party. But he came into office with a huge lead in the opinion polls, a big surge of support. And that was really based on a very simple, very focused message that he came in with, that he would get Brexit done, that there'd be no more messing around, he would push through an agreement, and that there'd be no more talk of extensions, we would be out by the 31st of December 2020. He followed that up with a purge of the moderates and the kind of the voices within the Conservative Party that were pressing for a softer deal. So people like Ken Clarke, Greg Clark, David Gauke, a whole series of senior ministers and senior Tory backbenchers were purged from the party. That was ahead of calling, succeeding in getting an election in December. He got a massive win. He got the 80-seat majority that I'd been predicting pretty much 18 months previously. And on the back of that, he sealed a deal, withdrawal agreement with the EU, which he was able to push through and secure parliamentary approval for, saying at the time, yeah, this is a fantastic deal. We've got everything we want. Next slide, please. And the sort of message that came with that was that, yeah, this is up and ready. There's nothing else that needs to be done. We just have this period of a year in which we negotiate the future relationship, but that is going to be easy because we've got a framework for that in the withdrawal agreement. And now we can get on with the serious stuff of the wider agenda, because of course Brexit for that whole period from 2016 through to the end of last year had dominated the political agenda in the UK, but also more importantly the government agenda. So there was nothing else really going on in terms of new legislation, new policy responses to problems from housing to climate change to you name it. So there's a whole idea to move on from Brexit and implement the radical policy agenda that was set out in the Tory manifesto for that December 2020 election. So the next slide, please. Leads us to one overarching or overhanging question, because Boris Johnson at that time, and to get the deal and to get the support of his party and to win the election, made three promises. The first was that the UK would leave the single market and the customs union. The second was that there'd be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. And the third was that there'd be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland once the UK had left the EU. And that was a trilemma that Theresa May had struggled with in trying to frame the withdrawal agreement, and Boris himself had sort of struggled with. And that's really the genesis of the problems and the controversy that we're seeing today, because those three promises cannot be made to work in conjunction. You can have two of them, but you can't have three of them. And we'll come back to that a bit later. So you can have the next slide, please. But it's worth remembering that that problem has been recognised all along. And then, of course, as Harold Macmillan sort of explained back in the 50s, when his government was knocked off course, the reason you can't implement your policies is events, dear boy, events. And the event, of course, was the coronavirus, global pandemic, the lockdown, and all the rest of it. And it's quite interesting. These are photographs that I took on a walk through London. I walked from home into Westminster one day in May, and these are the scenes at St Paul's and Trafalgar Square. You don't very often see them like that, nor do you very often see the skies quite that blue. But the pandemic completely derailed any ability that the government and that Boris Johnson would have had to use the early part of this year to implement and set out the radical reform agenda that he had for domestic politics and domestic policy. And of course, it also meant that while the negotiations on the future relationship with the EU were ongoing through all of that period, they were very, very much in the background. Nobody was paying really any attention to what was going on because there was a much, much more immediate crisis to be dealt with. So if you can have the next slide, please. And then there was the problem that really the emergency was made into a crisis. It became a political crisis because of the way in which the government was perceived to be handling it. And there were a lot of problems seen with that by many commentators. So everything from a perceived slow reaction and delay in implementing lockdown, breaches of the lockdown provisions by people close to Boris Johnson. The first, of course, was Robert Jenrick, the Housing and Communities Secretary of State, who travelled off to his second home to sit out the lockdown there. But more significantly and much more high profile, of course, was Dominic Cummings' trip to Durham to take refuge from the virus, and the sort of the very infamous day trip to Barnard Castle for his eye test, and the perception that the government was acting, or people within government were acting in a way that disregarded the law, disregarded the sacrifices that the population at large were being made to us. A government that was out of touch with reality and actually rather careless of perception and rather careless of how to translate intent into activity, and then that translated into significantly higher infection and mortality rates in the UK, and at points the UK was recording greater mortality than the rest of the EU put together. So this whole kind of spring and summer in the UK was overshadowed by crisis and by a sense of a government in considerable disarray. We have the next slide. We can see just how bad that was. So a whole series of kind of quite dramatic U-turns, everything over visa charges for NHS staff back in May, school reopenings, free summer schools, the fact that a Premiership footballer was led a campaign that forced the government to change its policy simply because it showed how out of touch the government was with the sense of the nation at large. The failure of the coronavirus app that was promised in the summer and still hasn't arrived, caving into pressure from the United States over the role of Huawei in 5G, and then most recently the exam results fiasco. And all of those are things that are stacking up in people's minds about how they will judge the performance of this government going forward. And one of the interesting things, of course, that's happened is that one of the key policy points that Boris Johnson came into power with, or came into government with after the election, was that he was abolished the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which is the measure that was brought in a few years ago that takes away from prime ministers the flexibility to hold an election whenever they want, and fixes a specific date every 5 years for it. Boris Johnson wanted to override that. They wanted to legislate against that to restore his ability to call an election at a time of his choosing when it would be most advantageous. And what is quite interesting is that there is no longer any talk of that happening, simply because there is no electoral advantage at the moment in going down that sort of route. Have the next slide, please. And the reason for that, you can see, is the the verdict that has started to emerge really over the summer. On the sort of the left of the screen, a recent Daily Mail cartoon and headline. Quite remarkable that Boris Johnson has managed to lose effectively the biggest cheerleader for his party and for Brexit in the space of about 6 to 7 months. And look on the right, the sort of most recent polling on perceptions of the party members in terms of favourability for their the various members of the cabinet. And the most important bit about that, right down, sort of quite low down the table, so he's not by any means the most unpopular person, but Boris Johnson's approval rating is down to under 25% within his own party. That is pretty disastrous. So the next slide, please. So by the end of the summer, it was clear that it was time for a plan. And of course, there's only one person making the plans within this government. There's arguably the case that there's only one person who constitutes this government, and that is Don Cummings. All of the key decisions are effectively his decisions. One of the interesting things about this government is that Boris Johnson is not, famously, is not a details man. He's not a man for policy. He's not a man for with a particular political agenda. So all the thinking, all the strategy is coming from Don Cummings, and that's an important factor to remember when we see how all of this is playing out. And the political debate is not really the debate that we need to be focusing on. The real thing we need to be focusing on is what is happening within Number 10 and the Cabinet Office. So the next slide, please. So the strategy, and it's sort of classic Dom, is when you're in trouble, and the trouble really that the government was facing over the summer was about its handling of COVID, about its handling of how we get back to, in inverted commas, normality, the debate about how quickly the economy should be reopened. So phase one of the rolling out this new strategy was to start saying, okay, let's turn the attention away, let's turn the attention somewhere else. And Brexit became a convenient place for that. Obviously, the deadline on the trade talks starting to loom. But by the time we got to August, we were down to 3 to 4 months to get a deal in place if a deal is to be done. So it started to have significance, and it became a handy tool for the displacement of anger away from the government's handling of coronavirus to something else. And the strategy was to say, look, we've got Brexit coming. We told you a while back that we could get a very good deal and it would be easy to get that deal, but actually we're not getting that now. We're being frustrated and hampered by the EU, and the messaging started to come out that the difficulties in these negotiations are the intransigence of the EU. And that led us to, I think, phase two of the strategy, which is in the next slide, please, which is where we are this week. And the Financial Times picked up on this. The scoop came out over the weekend that the UK is so frustrated with the EU on a couple of particular issues that it would unilaterally act to walk away from the agreement that was reached and that was hailed as being up and ready back in December of last year, and that led to us leaving the EU on the 1st of January. And lo and behold, somebody who we really haven't seen very much of this year at all suddenly popped up and said, that's great, because that deal was atrociously bad, and it is time for us to tear it up and move on to something else. So now we're into this situation of Brexit and the future relationship suddenly overshadowing everything else that has gone wrong for the government throughout this year. So if you can have the next slide, please. It is worth thinking very briefly about what are the substantive issues. And really there are two key issues that remain between the UK and the EU, both of which are covered in the withdrawal agreement from last year, and both of which kind of roll over into the future relationship agreement. The first is the issue of the level playing field. And the promise that was made by some of the key Brexiteers back in the referendum campaign and subsequently was that the UK can get a deal which leaves the single market, leaves the customs union, but has many of the advantages of continuing as a member of the EU, so free access to European markets. The European argument, of course, is, well, yes, you can have that, but you need a specific agreement that ensures a level playing field between our economies so that you can have access, provided you commit to signing up to future EU standards on everything from labelling to safety to origins to environment to labour law, whatever. Because otherwise, if you don't sign up to those and you change your standards, you reduce your standards, then you have unfair competition within our market. And the reason that's important to the EU is broadly shown by this slide, which shows that the share of the UK's trade with the EU is so enormous that it can't risk that kind of distorting effect of different standards right on its doorstep. So that's why there's a conflict around the level playing field. And the second, on the next slide, please, is the border issue. Leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and doing so, particularly doing so without those kind of level playing field provisions in place, means that somewhere there has to be a border between the UK and the EU so that appropriate checks can be made on goods flowing backwards and forwards, and also so that there's a mechanism for raising any tariffs that apply. And the key dispute there is that threefold sort of trilemma that I referred to earlier, where the original promise from Boris Johnson and government was that you have all of this without a specific border. There would be kind of alternative arrangements, kind of high-tech solutions that would deal with all of this. But the withdrawal agreement said, okay, that's all very well and good. And if that can be achieved in the future, that's how we can do it. But in the short term, in the absence of those sorts of measures, there has to be a border somewhere. And the only two places for that border are either in the physically on the land between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And that is something that is specifically prohibited by the Good Friday Agreement, which is the agreement that underpins the peace process in Northern Ireland, that underpins the re-establishment of government in Northern Ireland, and is a sort of an international treaty between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, overseen and, if you like, refereed by the United States, which says that there can be no hard border between the two parts of Ireland. And the promise to the Conservative Party and to the Farageist UKIP Brexit Party line that there would be no differential treatment of different parts of the UK. And of course, if you can't have the border on the island of Ireland, it has to be in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the GB. And that is what the withdrawal agreement proposes. It's the so-called protocol, Northern Ireland Protocol, which allows for those checks and those customs issues to be dealt with on anything flowing between the UK and Northern Ireland. And that is the problem, those two things are the key sticking points in the negotiations, and they are the issues that now the government, UK government, is trying to address in a unilateral way. So if we can have the next slide, please. There's a lot of detail on here, so don't try and read it. But what it is, this is sort of coming back to the politics of this. So what the government has said, and the most recent pronouncements, are that it will introduce UK domestic legislation that will allow it to override the withdrawal agreement, which is an international legally binding treaty. And essentially what it's saying is that it wants to be able to take unilateral action to proceed without imposing a border in the Irish Sea, which is the current requirement, and without adhering to level playing field restrictions. We don't at this stage know exactly what the terms of that proposal are, because that is to be set out in legislation, in fact, that is being published as I speak. But the reaction has been, as you've all no doubt probably seen, the reaction to that has been immediate, and it has been extreme. There are two reasons for that, really. The first is that for the first time, I think ever, and certainly in my experience, for the first time, a UK government has said it is prepared to act illegally, because taking domestic powers, domestic legislative powers to override an international treaty does not obviate the requirements of that treaty. So implementing those measures would be illegal in international law, and that was something that, bizarrely, Brandon Lewis, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, acknowledged in a statement in Parliament yesterday, to the shock of many, and to the fury of people like Theresa May, Bob Neill, and other kind of prominent Tories. But it's a very high-risk strategy, and what this slide is kind of intended to show is that, and really just sort of, you only need to look at there are the three columns there which cover UK political impacts, future relationship impacts, and future third-party trade impacts. And just look at the contrast between the red boxes and the green boxes, and don't worry too much about the content. But the green, yes, there are kind of short-term political gains within the UK. There's potentially some gain if the EU, reacts to this positively and decides to sit down and take it seriously as a bit of leverage in the negotiations. But predominantly, the long-term implications of this action are negative. And it's important to bear in mind that this is a Don Cummings ruse that is designed to get through a difficult set of political circumstances, which have flown out of really the reaction to coronavirus. But it's very dangerous. And if you look at the next slide, please. We come to 2 points. And the immediate reaction, of course, as you'd expect, from Simon Coveney there is the Irish government foreign minister, saying that this is a kind of very unwise way to proceed. But more importantly, the sort of incredulity among the key EU leaders. And one of the miscalculations, I think, in the UK's position is that it has been, or it's either a miscalculation or a misrepresentation. But the way that it's been presented is that Michel Barnier, the EU negotiator, has been very, very hard-line, and that actually the heads of government behind him, people like Macron and Merkel, are much more flexible, much more likely to do a deal because they want to sell their cars or their cheese or their wine into the UK. That is not the case. All the signals coming out of Europe are that, if anything, the political leaders of the EU 27 think that Barnier might be too soft on the UK in the negotiations and actually are pressing to take a harder line. And that's a very dangerous position for the UK to be in. So we're going to see over the next few days how that pans out. The latest formal round of negotiations are taking place this week, and there are some indications that, subject to whatever is in this legislation that is being published today, the EU side might terminate that round of negotiation early. So we'll have to wait and see. So if we can have the next slide, we can sort of start turning our minds briefly to where all of this is going, because there is an underlying when I call it strategy, I'm not sure if strategy is the right word for it. There is an underlying master plan to it, which is playing to an audience. You may have picked up a couple of weeks ago that there's a controversy about the appointment of Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister, as advisor to Liz Truss on trade negotiations. And one of the UK's problems, of course, is that it has no experience independently of negotiating trade deals. And the experience this year has not been good. Government promised 40 trade deals by the end of the year. Only about 2 of those have so far been signed, and with very, very insignificant players. So trying to sort of reframe a bit of the argument by saying, okay, we're ramping up the efforts. So Tony Abbott brought in, and the reason for bringing in Tony Abbott, despite his not having a particularly glittering record himself in trade, is to reinforce the idea, the message that the government has been pushing out, that leaving on no deal terms, which is a very real possibility now, is not a bad thing. Those are the terms they will say that Australia trades with the EU on, and look at how well Australia is doing. So bringing in an Australian expert will help us to navigate an Australia-style deal. It doesn't quite sound the same if you say, well, actually, the terms that Australia has are World Trade Organization terms. Those are the terms that, for example, Somalia trades with the EU on. You can't see either Don Cummings or Boris Johnson saying that we're leaving with a Somalia-style deal would go down quite as well. But that's the reality. But the impression is to try and say, okay, here is an Australian-style deal is a serious and useful and worthwhile one to have. If we can have the next slide. This isn't, as you can see, this is nothing to do with Brexit at all. But it seems to me that it is pointing towards the real agenda. The real agenda for bringing a very, very right-wing, very libertarian, very anti-regulation advisor like Abbott. And this is a Cummings. This is where Don Cummings comes. Don Cummings is virulently opposed to the nanny state and to regulation. And we are seeing small indications of where this is taking us. These slides, these pictures illustrate a recent reform to planning legislation, which basically says you can take shops, retail units on high streets, and you can turn them into residential properties without having to bother yourself with getting planning permission. And this is an example from Southampton. A unit of about 60 odd square meters turned into 5 separate residential units. So that's a very deregulatory, very pro-market approach, which says nothing about standards or environment or any of those sorts of things. We saw another example of it just on Monday evening, when the government imposed a 3-line whip on its MPs to vote against an amendment to a piece of legislation that would have required it to accept the recommendations of the Grenfell inquiry on future standards for cladding of tall buildings. We're seeing it as well in kind of wider reforms. The whole idea that office buildings, large office buildings, can be converted into residential without planning permission. That is the underlying agenda of the right wing of the Tory party, the European Research Group type members that I talked about before. It's clearly the agenda of the wider kind of Brexiteer community, which is to say, we need to get away from a heavily over-regulated environment. So what we really want to do here, and the reason we are very keen to break away from the level playing field requirements, is so that we can change our labour laws, change our environmental laws, change our laws on skills and so on. And that, it seems to me, and that is very much the agenda that is being pushed. If we can have the next slide. The question is it a price worth paying? For the right, it is, because a no deal outcome, or a very thin deal, would allow halting of freedom of movement. It allows the adoption of standards that would allow, in their view, an easier negotiation of other trade agreements. So, for example, getting away from EU requirements in agriculture, both for animal welfare and for environmental standards, would open up the UK market to more US agricultural products. This is the sort of the famous chlorinated chicken argument. So the idea is that by sweeping away EU regulation, we can fundamentally reform the way that the UK operates. The downside, of course, is we don't know, although we can possibly predict many of the ways in which the EU will react, and hence the sort of the lorry parks question. Sorry, particularly my nose. And the proposals just a week or so ago to allow the government to build lorry parks in some 30 different parts of the country to deal with these issues. And that brings us, I think, to another kind of issue in this, and I'm getting very close to the end. I know there'll be sort of questions piling up. Because of the ideology of not really wanting to engage seriously with Europe, and because of the overwhelming pressures of the coronavirus emergency, the government has not had the resource or the time to focus on how to manage the end of the transition period. And we are seeing already significant areas where businesses are saying, we are being put into a very difficult situation. Whatever the outcome of the negotiations, even if there is a trade deal of some sort agreed in the next few months, we are not going to be in a position to act on it. We are going to have to behave as though there is no deal. So, for example, on product labelling, the procurement timescales mean that the guidelines for future product labelling should have been issued in the summer to give people time to get the new requirements incorporated into their labelling for the end of the year. That guidance is nowhere near emerging. On freight transport, Freight Transport Association sent to the government 60-odd, I think 67 detailed questions on how freight transport will operate from the end of the year onwards. Those questions were sent in June, and they've had responses to 7 of them. So there's a huge problem. However this plays out, whether there's a deal or no problem, at least in the short term, there is a significant set of problems coming for business. If we have the next slide. Is it worth? Is the price that we're going through is worth paying? And the answer to that is politically. It probably is. The real issue and the long-term issue for government is what the state of the economy is going to look like by the time we get round to another election. And all forecasts, this one comes from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is a very well-respected independent think tank. All studies show that Brexit, one way or another, will affect the UK's GDP. No deal Brexit, obviously, more so than an exit with a deal. But in the short term, and this is the key politically, in the short term, coronavirus means that those effects will be masked by the recession following on from lockdown and the gradual return to normality. And if you look at the graph, it's really about 3 to 4 years before the Brexit impacts outweigh the COVID impacts. And that's what the government is gambling on, really, at the moment. The saber rattling and the posturing are all geared to deflecting attention away from the economic impacts of Brexit into other areas, and hoping that over the next 2 to 3 years, other things will come into play. They'll be able to settle down and get around to other policy agendas that will divert attention away from Brexit, something they've been desperate to do, hoping that it wouldn't dominate. And there is a good chance, I think there is a very good chance, given the way things operate, that they will succeed in that. The question is, do they have an agenda to follow through? And that's a question that really we don't know. But I think even a no-deal Brexit can be spun as a win, provided there are sort of no future COVID-like shocks. Which sort of brings me to the final slide, I think, which is how does it all end? And that's where I think I always end these sessions pretty much, and certainly when asked the question, I always say, well, if I knew the answer to that, I would be sitting on a tropical island somewhere, and, rather than in a small room in southeast London. It is impossible at this stage to say. My gut feeling at the moment is that a lot of as I've been saying, really, a lot of what the government has been doing in the last couple of months, a few weeks, has been around posturing and political positioning. But inadvertently, I think they have probably painted themselves into a corner where they're going to provoke such a strong reaction from the EU that the chances of a no-deal Brexit have gone up very significantly. I would say 20% chance of getting a deal. And even if there is a deal done, it will be the thinnest imaginable. That's my prediction of where the Brexit bit ends. How it ends for government will depend on how quickly they are able to use the freedoms that they get from that in ways that appeal to their voters in time for the election of 2022. And that's it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Got quite a few questions already, but keep them coming through. The first one you've kind of spoilt, David, because you've experienced in talking to us now. So what do you think will happen? I think you just dressed off quite nicely. So that kills the first question. The second one will be a two-part one, something I think you alluded to and said you were going to come back to. And then one you just left a very big question hanging in a presentation. So for the three promises, which is the most likely outcome, rather than what do you think will happen, but obviously which are the two scenarios that's most likely, or if they do go for the three, what are the consequences of breaking the treaty?
Yeah, okay. Well, of the three, the first, which is leaving the EU and leaving the customs union, that's effectively what we're going to do. That's what the withdrawal agreement sets out. And what it attempts to do then is to provide a framework for the UK to participate in the market, but from outside the formal structures. To achieve that, you need one of those other two things. You either need the border on the island of Ireland, or you need it in the Irish Sea. And the problem for the government is that to different audiences, it has said each of those is unacceptable. But one way or another, if we leave with no deal, the EU will then be forced to impose that border itself between the north and the south of Ireland. If we leave with a deal, the UK will have to put a border somewhere, and it will have to make the choice of whether it does it on land or at sea. As things stand, I think if we're heading for a no deal, then I think we are heading for an EU-imposed hard border on the island of Ireland, and I think that the thinking in number 10 is probably quite relaxed about that, because at all costs they want to be able to try to say any adverse outcome is consequence of EU intransigence, not of UK policy or failure.
Okay. And then, so in terms of breaking the treaty, what are the consequences?
Well, I think consequences are twofold. I mean, there's the sort of, if you like, there's a physical one, which we cannot really quantify, but what action would the EU take in retaliation? And that could be a whole raft of things, from, as I was saying, sort of alluded to earlier, it could just walk away from the negotiations and say, right, that's it. 40% tariffs on everything you do from now on. That's one element. Second, and I think probably even more serious, is what does it do for the UK's reputation? The UK likes to think of itself as if you like, one of the sort of occupiers of the moral high ground in international relations terms. It's very quick to point the finger at rogue states, those who don't comply with international obligations. How far do you get with that? If you have secretaries of state who are willing to stand up in Parliament and say we are fully contemplating to act in a way that we know is illegal. So that's, I think the reputational damage would be immense and be very damaging. And I think the third issue is, what faith will future interlocutors have on anything that the UK government says? So if you're negotiating a future trade deal as the government of another country, how much of what you're told do you believe? So I think it stores up immense difficulties in the future. The other thing, and it hasn't sort of particularly come out very strongly, is that not only with the action that they're contemplating breach the withdrawal agreement treaty, it would be a direct breach of the Good Friday Agreement, which would put us on a real collision course with the United States, which of course has huge Irish-American influences. Joe Biden, I saw just earlier on today, saying that any adverse consequences of UK behaviour for the Good Friday Agreement would seriously jeopardise any negotiations on a free trade agreement with any future administration that he would run. So it's a big, big, big gamble.
Okay. Again, I'm going to bundle a couple of questions together. It's clear probably all along that the political line from the EU was they wanted to deter other states from contemplating exit as well as part of the thing. I think it's been stated by members of the EU that it's got to be painful to stop it looking attractive.
Yeah.
And there's clearly that deterrence effect in their negotiation, but the flip side to that coin is how much do they value our trade, and how much would a no deal harm them? Because presumably with tariff wars, it's normally reciprocal. So if we put 40% on the EU imports.
We're I think obviously that there is harm to the EU. I think they've never pretended anything other than that they are sorry to see the relationship with the UK end. But it's slightly disproportionate because if you like, the proportion of value of the UK to the EU is lower than the other way around. Simply, and that's purely a function of size, really. That you think that the UK is an economy of 60 odd million. The rest of the EU is an economy of nearly 500 million. So the damage proportionately will be less to the EU as a whole than it will be to the UK. So I think that they're a little bit relaxed on that. Of course, they are far more advanced in terms of agreements that they already have in place around the rest of the world. So to some extent, and there are some in the EU who say, great, if the UK falls out of all of our agreements with other key partner economies and has to go to world trade terms, then actually that works to our advantage. And it's a very disproportionate thing because clearly Ireland is the one that will suffer most because of its very partly because of its interdependency with the UK, but also because of the land bridge that it has to the rest of Europe. So it's a kind of a disproportionate thing, but I think the overwhelming priority for the key EU leaders is with the integrity and the protection of the single market. And the UK is turning its back on that, so therefore they're ready to write us out.
Fair enough. A more sort of built environment one, but this one I think it transfers across to the whole relationship between regulation and government and general population. Is with the ability to deregulate, and possibly, one of the EU stances is they don't want standards dumbed down in the UK so that we have a lesser, but ethically and morally, and also from investor insurance requirements, etc. And this was driven, the question I've got was from Grenfell, but I see it on a wider thing. Is it likely there'll be pressures to maintain or even raise standards?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. A lot of people I talk to in business say, well, actually, whatever the government's position is, and even if the government allows for standards to be reduced, we won't necessarily do it because we still want to have access to those markets. I think there will be a big tussle, and there's going to be a huge tussle, and I think it's going to be fought out very much within the Conservative Party between what I would almost call the old style kind of Brexiteer free marketeers, the Bernard Jenkins, the Steve Bakers, the Rees-Moggs of this world, who want to push on, say that Thatcher never went far enough, we need to strip away all this regulation. And the younger generation, particularly kind of some of the people in the so-called red wall constituencies who've taken, who are actually going to look at this and say, well, the people that we represent can't afford to have their employment safeguards reduced. They can't afford. We need these safeguards. They can't afford to have the housing market deregulated in such a way that they end up living in 15 square meter hutches. So there's going to be, I think that there will be a big ideological fight within the Tory party in the coming years about which direction that goes in. Problem the party has got at the moment, of course, is that Boris Johnson probably doesn't have a view on those issues of his own. His focus isn't, he's not into that level of detail, he's not that concerned. Dominic Cummings, who is the one who's thinking about it, is the man who sort of says, well, we don't need all this kind of government interference because an algorithm can sort it all out for us. So that's going to be a big battle. The extent to which they are going to be prepared to listen to external voices, in the short term at least, I think is the most worrying thing. I think that there is no appetite to listen to to industry bodies or to experts. So even where there is there will be people saying we need to maintain standards, we want to enhance standards. There will be a certain closedness to hearing those messages.
Okay, thank you. And one last very quick one, which probably will affect most, if not all of us on the call, is the movement to Labour.
Yeah. Well, we're there. Free movement within the EU ended, or effectively ended at the end of last year. So it's still possible under the transition period, but the figures are already showing that numbers are massively down simply because people aren't taking the risk of coming. At the same time, we've had record non-EU migration. So there is a sort of an inevitable dynamic, is that the economy needs workers, and it's been recognised by a lot of people for a long time that migrant workers are essential to the economy, even with an economic downturn. That seems to be the case. So my guess is that economic reality will prevail, and that there will continue to be free movement. Well, not free movement, but there will continue to be significant flows of migrants. They will just be from very different places. Of course, it does raises questions. The sort of Australia-style approach with the points system, how that impacts things, whether people start over time to think the UK becomes a less attractive place to come to will be the key.
Okay, thank you. And then I suppose one very, very last question, which will be a quick answer, is can we get you back in 12 months' time to give us hopefully finally this is what Brexit is, and these are the impacts, because as ever you've given more questions and more thoughts than you've answered.
Yeah.
So
was it? Yes. Well, yeah. I'm sort of conscious that there wasn't a lot of time for questions, so apologies for that. And I'm more than happy if there are sort of follow-up questions to sort of pick them up and do a note on anything that would be of interest to people. And directly to the question, if we're all still here, yes.
Hopefully in 12 months' time we'll be able to do it face to face, and we will have more relaxed and less time pressured environment for questions. There are I think there's a CPD number which is going to be pushed on the chat box for everyone. I've got the next slide. I've got a couple of wrapping up ones to do. So the corporate plug, the IWFM website's got a variety of resources to support the profession, including good practice guides, guidance reports, and more. Please visit the website and go to Insight to find out more. And then next slide, please. To help the profession through the pandemic, IWFM also has a coronavirus resources hub where you will find advice and resources on everything from dealing with the impacts of the virus to managing the safe return of the workplace. You will also find recordings of every episode of this Navigating Turbulent Times series in there. So please visit iwfm.org.uk/coronavirus. And then lastly, if you've got any questions for IWFM, or you have case studies or best practice to share, please get in touch via email, policy@iwfm.org.uk. But finally, the most important thing is thank you ever so much, David, for your time and what you've shared with us. I'm going to go away and put a cold towel around my head, which I normally do after one of your sessions, and think, but yeah, absolutely fascinating, and hopefully it's nice to have a broader impact on something outside of the profession, and probably at the moment everyone on the call was quite happy to spend an hour of their time not talking about COVID. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed it. So thank you. Thank you for asking me.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bye, and thank you everyone for attending. Really appreciate it, and hopefully look forward to seeing some of you again face to face.